Transferred $1,500 a month to my parents for 5 years. But when I asked them to babysit my son while I was away, they replied, "We're not your babysitters." So I stopped their financial support and blocked their numbers. My name is Sheila Martinez, and 4 years ago, my entire world turned upside down. I was 32 years old, a software programmer working remotely with a bright-eyed 4-year-old son named Max who was my entire universe. The divorce from my husband, Mark, had been a quiet, almost clinical affair. No dramatic courtroom scenes. No screaming matches. Just the painful reality of betrayal, neatly packaged and filed away. Mark's infidelity had been the final blow to our marriage. I discovered the truth accidentally. A text message left open. A photo that wasn't meant for my eyes. But even in the midst of my heartbreak, I wanted to protect Max. We agreed to split everything fairly. The house, our savings, our future. Max would stay with me with Mark taking him during holidays. It was a clean break or so, I thought. The money from selling our house gave me a financial cushion. Enough to start over, to breathe. That's when my parents entered the picture with what seemed like a well-intentioned plan. They lived in a neighboring state and their pitch was almost too perfect. "Come home," they said. "It'll be easier here." Their reason sounded logical. The cost of living was lower. My programming job could be done from anywhere. They promised to help with Max, to be the support system I desperately needed. And there was another layer. My older sister lived nearby, and they wanted the family to be closer together. I was exhausted. Emotionally drained from the divorce, from single parenting, from trying to keep everything together. Their offer felt like a lifeline, a chance to catch my breath. So I talked to Mark's parents, my former in-laws who surprisingly had remained kind and supportive even after our divorce. They were sad about the potential distance, but understood my need to rebuild. Max was excited about the move. He was at that age where everything was an adventure. "Are we going on a big trip, Mommy?" he'd ask, his brown eyes wide with enthusiasm. I would ruffle his hair and smile, hoping this move would be our fresh start. When we first arrived at my parents' house, everything seemed promising. Max ran around, exploring every room, his laughter echoing through the hallways. But gradually, I started noticing the subtle shifts, the moments that would reveal the true nature of our new living arrangement. My parents' welcome felt performative. Their smiles seemed rehearsed, their enthusiasm forced. When Max would get excited, jump around, or make typical 4-year-old noise, they would exchange these looks. Looks of exhaustion, a barely concealed irritation. "He's so active," my mother would say, her tone more complaint than observation. I would always defend him. "He's just a child." I'd reply softly, "This is how children are supposed to be." But their reactions told a different story. When my sister would visit with her 3 children, the atmosphere would transform completely. Suddenly, my parents were different people, engaged, playful, hanging on every word their eldest daughter's children said. The contrast was painful, but I told myself I was imagining things. I was just tired, overwhelmed by the recent changes in my life. The apartment search became my primary focus. I needed our own space, a sanctuary away from the growing tension. Max would bounce around our temporary room, playing with his toys, occasionally peeking out to ask if we had found our new home yet. Weeks turned into months. The realtor kept showing options, but nothing felt right. And all the while, the undercurrent of financial expectation grew stronger in my parents' house. One evening, during dinner, the atmosphere shifted. My parents exchanged a look, that specific look that always meant money was about to be discussed. My mother, her voice carefully controlled, began the conversation. "The expenses have increased since you and Max moved in," she said, her fork precisely positioned on the plate. I was prepared. I had been contributing financially since we arrived. "I'm already giving you $500 each month for utilities and food," I responded, keeping my tone neutral. But that wasn't enough. They wanted $1,500 every month. "We're looking after Max," my father added, as if that justified the astronomical sum. Looking after Max? The irony was painful. I worked from home. They might have picked him up from kindergarten 2 or 3 times a month. Their idea of looking after seemed to involve parking him in front of the television or sighing dramatically whenever he made a sound. I could have argued. I could have pointed out how little they actually did, but I was tired, emotionally drained from the past few years. So I transferred the money, thinking it was a small price to pay for family support. The apartment search dragged on, stretching into the second month of our stay with my parents. Each viewing became a roller coaster of hope and disappointment. The realtor would pull up to another potential home. Max's hand clutched tightly in mine, his eyes wide with anticipation. "Is this our new home, Mommy?" he'd ask, his voice tinged with hope. Every single time, I'd have to disappoint him. "Not quite yet, sweetie," I'd respond, forcing a smile that felt more like a grimace. The stack of rejected apartment listings was growing. a physical representation of our limbo. My parents' house had become a pressure cooker of unspoken tensions. My sister had perfected the art of using our parents as an endless childcare service. She would drop off her 3 children without warning, disappearing for hours or even entire days. Unlike my carefully raised son, Max, who understood the importance of staying quiet during my work hours, her children were a whirlwind of noise and chaos. One particularly stressful afternoon, I was in the middle of a critical video conference for work. My sister's children burst into the room I was using as a temporary workspace. They were running, screaming, almost knocking over my laptop. The potential clients on the other end of the call could hear the commotion. Desperate to maintain some semblance of professionalism, I approached my mother. "Could you please help calm the children?" I asked softly, trying to keep the desperation out of my voice. Her response was swift and cutting. "You're being selfish," she snapped, her eyes narrowing. "My older daughter's children are very well-mannered and calm." The accusation hung in the air. My son, quiet, well-behaved Max, was somehow the problem? I said nothing. This was a battle I had fought countless times before, and I knew exactly how it would end. The financial arrangement continued its relentless rhythm. Each month, I would transfer $1,500 to my parents, supposedly for utilities and childcare. In reality, their childcare was minimal at best. I worked from home, and they might pick Max up from kindergarten 2 or 3 times a month, if that. But I continued to pay. Peace, I told myself, was worth the price. After what felt like an endless search, the realtor finally found the perfect apartment. It checked all the boxes: good location, right size, within our budget. Max was over the moon when we packed our belongings and prepared to move. The relief on my parents' faces was palpable. They had been eager to reclaim their space, to be free of what they saw as our burden. Their goodbye was perfunctory, more a sigh of relief than a moment of familial warmth. Our first couple of weeks in the new apartment were blissful. A sense of freedom of finally having our own space permeated every room. Max would spin around the living room, declaring it the most awesome home ever. Then the phone call came. My mother didn't even bother with a greeting. "Why haven't you transferred the $1,500? She demanded, her voice sharp and urgent. I was momentarily stunned. "I've moved out," I explained patiently. "I won't be paying you anymore. That money was for living in your house." What followed was a masterclass in emotional manipulation. Tears erupted from her, a sudden and dramatic performance. She claimed they had been counting on this money, that they had taken out a loan expecting to repay it from my monthly transfers. I tried to reason with her. "I need this money for Max," I explained, hoping she would understand. But understanding was not on her agenda. The tears continued, a calculated display designed to break my resolve. Finally, I capitulated. "I'll continue to send you money for another 6 months, I said, just to stop the emotional onslaught. The transformation was instantaneous. Her tears dried up immediately. Suddenly, she was thanking me profusely, her voice saccharine sweet. I added one condition, that they would occasionally look after Max when I needed help. She agreed without hesitation and quickly hung up. This became our new normal. Every 6 months, I would request my parents to watch Max. Each time, they would agree, but only after considerable persuasion. When they did watch him, their sighs and complaints were constant. "He's so exhausting," they would say, as if watching their grandson was some unbearable burden. When I'd ask Max about his time at their house, his responses were telling. "I just wanted to play," he'd say simply. But I knew the reality. His grandmother would park him in front of the television, instructing him to watch cartoons and not disturb her. Month after month, year after year, the cycle continued. I would transfer $1,500 and they would do the absolute minimum in return. Like clockwork, they would send reminder messages about the upcoming transfer, a few days before it was due. Our relationship had become a transaction. Cold, calculated, devoid of the love and warmth that should exist between parents and their child. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon. My ex-mother-in-law's voice was heavy with grief, each word laden with the weight of loss. "John passed away," she told me, her voice cracking. "The funeral will be in 3 days. My former father-in-law had always been different from my own parents. Kind, understanding. He'd been a constant source of support, even after my divorce from Mark. I remembered how he would slip Max extra cookies when we visited, how he'd listen intently to Max's rambling stories about school and video games. I knew I had to attend the funeral. But first, I needed someone to watch Max. I went to my parents' house that evening, Max trailing behind me with his backpack. The familiar tension filled the air the moment we walked in. My parents were seated in their matching recliners, the TV murmuring in the background. "Mom, Dad," I began, "something serious has happened. My former father-in-law passed away." My father muted the television. My mother turned slightly, her expression guarded. "I need to go to the funeral," I explained. Would you be able to watch Max for a couple of days? The response was instantaneous and brutal. Absolutely not, my father said, sitting up straight. His voice was sharp, final. We are not babysitters. I stared at them shocked. What do you mean? My mother's voice cut through the silence. We have plans. We can't just drop everything to watch your son. But you always watch Sarah's kids, I pointed out. My sister regularly dumped her 3 children with them, disappearing for hours or even days. That's different, my mother snapped. Her tone was dismissive, cruel. Those are our grandchildren. The implication hung in the air. Max wasn't a real grandchild, not to them. He is your grandchild, I said, my voice rising. Max stood quietly beside me, watching this exchange with wide, understanding eyes. My father stood up. We're going to dinner with friends, he said, moving towards me. You need to leave. They began physically pushing me towards the door. My mother's final words were a knife to the heart. You're a bad mother, she hissed. Trying to dump your kid on us at the last minute. I stood on their doorstep, Max clutching my hand, completely stunned. They were refusing to help me, refusing to support me in my moment of grief. My sister would be no help. She never assisted me with Max, never offered support. Defeated, I called my best friend from school, the one person who had always been there for me. Hey, Sarah, I said, my voice breaking. I need a huge favor. My friend didn't hesitate for a second. Of course, I'll watch Max, she said warmly. He can stay with my daughter. They're about the same age and get along great. The drive to the funeral was long. I thought about John, about the complicated family dynamics that had defined my life. When I arrived, my ex-mother-in-law was a fragile figure in black, surrounded by sympathetic relatives. Sheila, she said, embracing me. Thank you for coming. Mark was there too. We hadn't spoken much since the divorce, but today was different. Grief has a way of breaking down barriers. How's Max? He asked during a quiet moment between condolences. I told him about Max's recent school project, about his growing interest in science. Mark listened, a soft smile playing on his lips. For a moment, we were just 2 parents talking about their son. After the funeral, I helped my ex-mother-in-law with practical matters, sorting through paperwork, making phone calls, handling the endless administrivia that follows a death. John always loved you, she told me unexpectedly. He thought you were too good for my son. We both laughed, a moment of unexpected lightness in the midst of grief. When I returned home and collected Max from Sarah's house, everything felt different. The genuine kindness my friend showed, without expecting anything in return, highlighted how transactional my relationship with my parents had become. That evening, the familiar text arrived from my mother, her monthly reminder about the money transfer. But something had changed inside me. I didn't respond. Instead, I went to my computer and canceled the monthly transfer. A strange sense of calm washed over me. The phone rang almost immediately. Why didn't you transfer the money? My mother demanded. No greeting. No pretense. I'm not sending you money anymore. I said calmly. She was apoplectic. What? How can you do this to us? We're your parents. I reminded her of the funeral, of their repeated refusals to help, of years of emotional manipulation. She began screaming. Accusations flew. You're destroying our lives. We have a loan. We were counting on that money. That's not my problem, I said simply and hung up. The call started. Parents, sister, ignored, blocked. A week later, they physically attempted to break into my apartment. I heard them before I saw them. My mother's shrill voice, my father's angry muttering, my sister's manipulative wheedling. She can't just cut us off, my sister was saying. I stood behind the door listening. They tried the door handle, knocked, rang the doorbell repeatedly. When that failed, I heard a scraping sound. Were they trying to pick the lock? Sheila, my mother screamed. Open this door right now. We just want to talk, my father added. I shouted through the closed door. I have nothing to say to you. Leave. They continued for what felt like hours. Threats, pleas, manipulation. The full arsenal of emotional warfare they had perfected over years. Finally, they left. 2 months of silence had passed since I blocked my family's numbers. The peace was profound, unlike anything I had experienced in years. Max seemed transformed, lighter, more carefree, without the constant undercurrent of tension that had existed when my parents were part of our lives. I was deep into a complex programming project, lines of code filling my screen, when my phone rang. The caller ID showed my aunt's number. My father's sister had always been different from the rest of my family, more level-headed, less prone to drama. Sheila, she began without preamble. We need to talk. Her voice carried a weight that immediately caught my attention. I could hear background noise, what sounded like a coffee shop, the distant of conversations, the hiss of an espresso machine. I'm listening, I said, minimizing my work window. She took a deep breath. It's about your parents. Things are complicated. My aunt proceeded to detail the financial mess my parents had created. They had taken out a substantial loan, nearly $50,000, to help my sister completely renovate her house. This wasn't just a minor home improvement. We're talking a full-scale transformation. A brand new gourmet kitchen with marble countertops, a complete bathroom remodel with imported Italian tiles, hardwood floors imported from Europe, and custom-built cabinetry. They were counting on your monthly transfers to repay the loan, my aunt explained. Her tone was matter-of-fact, not accusatory. When you stopped sending money, everything started falling apart. I listened, letting her continue. The worst part, she said, lowering her voice, your sister refuses to help them now. She says it's their problem. As if on cue, I pulled up social media and found my sister's recent posts. There they were, a series of glamorous photos showcasing her newly renovated home. Professional quality images of her gleaming kitchen, her luxurious bathroom, her perfectly staged living spaces. The captions were filled with hashtags like, Dream Home, Renovation Complete, Living My Best Life. The audacity took my breath away. Her parents had essentially bankrupted themselves to create the showpiece, and she was proudly displaying it online while refusing to help them financially. She's acting like she did this all on her own, I muttered. My aunt heard me. Your parents spent their entire savings. They're even using their retirement money to cover the loan payments. The irony was thick. The same sister who had always been the golden child, who had consistently dumped her children on my parents, who had received endless support, was now turning her back on them completely. They're desperate, my aunt continued. Your mother has been calling everyone, trying to find a way out of this mess. I felt something shift inside me. Not guilt, not a desire to help, just a profound understanding of how my parents had engineered their own destruction. Max wandered into my home office, interrupting my thoughts. Are you okay, Mom? He asked, looking up at me with those big, perceptive eyes. I smiled genuinely. I'm perfect, I said, and I meant every word. Life continued its relentless march forward. Max was flourishing in ways I had never imagined possible. His school reports were stellar, not just academically, but in terms of his social skills and emotional intelligence. The toxic environment of constant criticism was gone, replaced by genuine support and love. My career was reaching new heights. A recent promotion to senior programming architect came with a significant raise and more challenging projects. The company appreciated my dedication, my ability to work efficiently while raising a child on my own. Max had become my perfect work companion. Quiet, understanding, respecting my professional space. One quiet Sunday morning, as we shared pancakes, Max looked at me with unexpected seriousness. I'm glad we don't see Grandma and Grandpa anymore, he said. I was careful in my response. Why do you say that? They were always mean. He said simply. Never wanted to play with me. Always complained. Made me watch TV instead of doing fun things. His observation was heartbreakingly mature. I realized how much he had understood even when he was younger. The emotional toll my parents had taken wasn't just on me. It had deeply affected Max. I love you, I told him, reaching out to ruffle his hair. Love you too, Mom, he responded, returning to his pancakes. My relationship with Mark, my ex-husband, had also evolved. Our co-parenting had become a model of cooperation. Regular video calls about Max's progress, shared decisions about his education, collaborative planning for his future. Then came the unexpected phone call. It was my mother calling from an unknown number. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pause. Sheila, she said, her voice softer than I remembered. Can we talk? I remained silent. I know things went wrong, she continued. Your father and I have talked. We understand now. We're not calling about money. She went on to explain how my sister no longer brought her children to visit, how they missed Max, how they wanted to start over, rebuild our relationship. We miss our grandson, she said, a hint of desperation in her voice. I listened. Remembered all the years of manipulation, the constant financial demands, the way they had treated Max. No, I said simply and hung up. My friend Sarah, the one who had been there during the funeral, who had watched Max, remained a constant source of support. We would have coffee, share stories about work and life. She never judged my decision to cut off my parents. You deserve peace, she would say. A life without toxic people dragging you down. As months passed, I realized something profound. The monthly $1,500 I had been sending my parents wasn't just money. It was a form of emotional blackmail. A way they maintained control, kept me in a perpetual state of guilt and obligation. By stopping those transfers, I hadn't just saved money. I had bought back my freedom. My dignity. Max and I were building our own family, not defined by blood or traditional expectations, but by love, respect, and genuine care for each other. When updates about my parents' continuing struggles reached me, I felt nothing. No anger, no guilt, no desire to help. We were okay, more than okay. We were happy.